somewhere along the path of waking up, maybe after a sudden shift in awareness or the quiet unraveling of who you thought you were, your motivation disappeared, not just for tasks or routines, but for life itself. The inner momentum that once pushed you forward, to achieve, to improve, to matter, began to fade. You thought waking up would bring clarity, and in some ways, it did. You saw through the striving, the roles, the performance of being someone, and for a moment, that insight felt like freedom. But then, the stillness. Not peace, not rest, something emptier, like standing in a world that no longer speaks your language. You stopped chasing, you stopped pretending, not out of despair, but because the old reasons no longer held any weight. And in that silence, a harder question began to surface. Why do I have no motivation now that I finally see clearly? This is the part no one warns you about. The flatness that follows the revelation. The absence of urgency that feels less like relief and more like disorientation. Carl Jung named this space. He called it sacred, the hollow between the collapse of who you were and the emergence of who you're becoming. You're not broken, you're becoming honest. You still wake up in the morning, you still make the coffee, open your inbox, answer when someone calls your name. But something fundamental is missing, not visibly, not dramatically, just quietly, like a thread that once held your life together has slipped out without you noticing. And now everything feels slightly undone. On the outside, you're functional, maybe even calm, but on the inside, you're floating, detached. The ambitions that once drove you feel like they belong to someone else, a version of you that could still believe in all of it. You look at the world, at the people building, striving, branding themselves, and feel an almost surreal kind of distance. Not judgment, not envy, just a sense of being somewhere else internally. And it's disorienting, because you didn't collapse, you didn't give up, you simply don't feel pulled anymore. The engine went quiet, and when others ask what you're working on, what's next, what you're aiming for, there's a pause. Not because you're hiding something, but because you genuinely don't know how to answer. There's no clear direction, no spark to chase, and worst of all, no panic about that, just a dull ache of confusion. This is where the real rupture begins, not with a breakdown, but with a non-reaction. You didn't fall apart, you just stopped caring. And yet, beneath that flatness, there's something intelligent happening. You sense it in the quiet, in the stillness, in the way your body resists going back to what you know no longer fits. But your mind hasn't caught up yet. It still whispers old questions. What's wrong with me? Why can't I just push through? Where did my hunger go? You don't know how to explain it, because this isn't burnout, and it's not depression, at least not in the way we're taught to recognize it. It's something more subtle, more existential. You've outgrown the identity that gave your life its fuel, and now you're standing in the space between who you were and who you're not yet able to become. That's the disorientation no one talks about, and it's made harder by a culture obsessed with direction. We're expected to always know what's next, to have a vision, a plan, a personal brand. Stillness is seen as a flaw, uncertainty is pathologized, and the absence of motivation, that's treated like failure, so you keep trying to explain it to yourself, to others. You say you're reevaluating, or taking a break, or figuring things out. But none of that captures the truth, because you're not just between jobs or in a rut. You're standing in the psychic residue of having seen through a former self. And now, nothing familiar feels quite real. This is the moment Jung pointed to, the space where the ego has been stripped of its usual narrative, but the deeper self has not yet emerged. It's not a pause in your story. It's a different story beginning to form, one you haven't yet learned how to tell. You're not lacking motivation. You're shedding the reasons you used to need it. For most of your life, motivation was tied to identity. You moved forward because you believed in a version of yourself. The achiever, the fixer, the artist, the seeker. You shaped your choices around who you thought you were supposed to be. Even your passions were often filtered through that lens. Will this make me successful? Will this prove I'm worthy? Will this give me a place in the world? And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. As Jung wrote, the persona is a system of behavior imposed by societal expectations. It's the mask we wear to function, and for a time, that mask is necessary. It helps us survive, connect, build. The persona fuels motivation because it has something to protect, a story it wants others to believe. But what happens when that story stops making sense? What happens when you see the persona for what it is? A patchwork of old fears, inherited scripts, survival patterns that no longer reflect your inner truth. That's what waking up often reveals. And when the ego loses its script, motivation collapses with it, because the part of you that used to push, strive, perform, no longer sees the point. This isn't dysfunction, it's a profound shift in the psyche. Motivation in the egoic state is often reactive. It's fueled by what you think you need to become in order to be safe or accepted. I need to succeed, so I'm not abandoned. I need to be productive, so I'm not seen as lazy. I need to keep growing so I don't fall behind. When those beliefs dissolve, the motivation they powered dissolves too. And at first, that feels like emptiness. But what you're actually feeling is a silence that precedes a deeper truth. Jung called this the beginning of individuation, the process by which a person becomes whole by integrating the unconscious parts of themselves. He described this stage not as clarity, but as nigredo, the blackening, a psychological death, a stripping away of false structures. The ego is not dead. It's disoriented. It no longer knows how to orient your life around goals that don't feel real anymore. And it hasn't yet learned to serve the deeper self, the part of you that moves from alignment, not performance. This in-between phase feels like numbness, but it's actually the psyche recalibrating. What you're experiencing is not absence, it's withdrawal from illusion, a refusal, often unconscious, to continue living by a script that was never fully yours. You didn't lose your will. You lost the reasons that used to animate it. And until new reasons emerge from deeper within, the system stays still. Not broken, just waiting. This is where so many people panic. They try to reignite the old engine. They mistake the quiet for laziness, the pause for failure. But Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The old drives were unconscious. They came from wounds, expectations, projections. Now that you're waking up, those drivers are being exposed, and the self, the deeper you, will not build a life on lies. So it stops. It silences the machinery. And in that stillness, if you can bear it, a new kind of energy begins to form, one not rooted in fear, but in coherence. But first, you have to stand in the hollow, the place where the ego's voice fades, and the self is still learning how to speak. This is where most people start to wonder if something's gone wrong, not because they're in pain exactly, but because they're in something worse, a fog that doesn't move. You're not falling apart, you're functioning. Technically, you show up, respond, fulfill the bare minimum, but everything feels muted. Time stretches strangely. Nothing really lands. You're no longer asleep, but you're not fully awake either. You're caught in that strange in-between, the hollow between identities, and no one talks about how heavy that hollow can feel. It's not dramatic, and that's part of what makes it so hard to name. You're not sobbing. You're not rageful. You're just still, in the unsettling way. the kind of stillness that feels more like stasis than serenity. And yet, it's sacred, because what's actually happening here is dismantling. The drives that used to define you, ambition, recognition, growth, even passion, aren't just missing. They're being stripped from the old scaffolding they clung to. You're watching them fall without knowing what's meant to replace them. This is not laziness, it's a withdrawal from a false self. But the psyche hasn't constructed the new one yet. So you drift. And it's hard to admit how much that drift terrifies you. You keep wondering, what if I never feel lit up again? What if nothing comes back? What if this emptiness is permanent? Because unlike burnout, this isn't about being tired. You've rested, you've journaled, you've done the inner work, and still no spark. You don't want to go back to your old life, but you don't yet know how to live a new one. This is the threshold Jung spoke of with precision. He called it the nigredo, the blackening, the first stage of alchemy, a place of dissolution where all structures of the false self fall apart. It is not depression in the clinical sense, though it shares its shadows. It is a psychological death, not of life, but of illusion. And our culture has no language for this, no patience for stillness, no respect for the pause between who you were and who you're becoming. In a world obsessed with progress, dissent is misdiagnosed as dysfunction. So you start to doubt yourself, and that doubt becomes a second layer of paralysis. Not only do you feel lost, now you're ashamed for feeling lost. You internalize the silence as failure. But you are not failing. You are in a process the world cannot see, because it happens below the surface. This is the descent into the unconscious. And the unconscious doesn't speak in goals or bullet points. It speaks in symbols, in feelings, in silence. It asks you to wait, not because there's nothing to do, but because what's coming next is not something you can force. The self does not respond to pressure. It responds to presence. So if you feel like you're in free fall, like the world keeps spinning while you stay still, it's not because you're behind. It's because you're deep inside a metamorphosis that can't be rushed. If you've stayed in the stillness long enough, not forced your way out, not numbed yourself back into performance, something strange begins to happen. Not all at once, not like a thunderbolt or an epiphany, but like a quiet hum deep beneath the noise. A different kind of energy starts to rise. It's not the adrenaline of ambition, not the caffeine rush of proving something to the world. It's slower, warmer, less about movement and more about rightness. You don't feel driven, you feel drawn. You find yourself wanting to create again, not for recognition, but because the act itself feels like returning to something true. You want to reach out, not because you should, but because presence matters again. You begin to notice what resonates, not just what looks good on paper. You choose differently. You say no more often. You say yes more slowly. And in those small, almost imperceptible shifts, the self is beginning to take the lead. Jung called this the beginning of individuation, the slow realignment of the psyche around wholeness rather than image, where motivation isn't driven by the need to escape shame, but by the quiet pull of integrity. There's no roadmap for this kind of emergence, because what's forming isn't a goal. It's a relationship, one between you and something deeper, something less reactive, something that doesn't scream but doesn't lie. And it's this honesty that starts to rebuild you. You begin to act, not because you're trying to be someone, but because not acting would feel like a betrayal of something essential. This is the self-led impulse, not performative, not strategic, but coherent, whole, quietly true. It feels different in your body, not urgent, but anchored, not aggressive, but rooted. You're not chasing energy anymore. You're moving from it. And that shift changes everything. Because once you've tasted this non-performative fire, you can't go back to the old way. You can't force your way forward anymore. The old rewards don't tempt you. The old fears don't control you. You're no longer trying to win the game. You're trying to live a life that feels honest. And that honesty finally begins to stir something that can last. In the world you came from, the one built around output, urgency, and image, there is no space for this kind of silence. Motivation in that world is currency. If you have it, you're seen as strong, focused, ambitious. If you lose it, you're seen as weak, lost, regressing. And so this phase, this sacred pause, this ego unraveling becomes something most people never speak about. Not because it isn't common, but because it doesn't fit the narrative. You can't build a personal brand around stillness. You can't monetize metamorphosis while it's still in the dark. Jung saw this clearly. He warned that the modern world is deeply uncomfortable with inner dissent because it has no language for a transformation that doesn't look like progress. It pathologizes pause, it fears ambiguity, it rushes healing into performance. So when you find yourself no longer wanting to play the game, not because you're cynical, but because you're awake, you might be tempted to think you're failing, but you're not. You're just in a phase the world doesn't reward because it can't control it. This is the liminal space, the in-between, the undoing that precedes integration. In alchemy, this phase wasn't skipped, it was revered, it was understood as necessary. The Negredo was not failure, it was the prerequisite for transformation. But in our culture, stillness is labeled as apathy. Questioning is labeled as weakness. The absence of motivation is assumed to be a flaw. And so, instead of being held in this space, witnessed, supported, understood, you're left to navigate it alone. Internally dismantling a life that once made sense, while outwardly pretending you're still okay. That's the double bind. You're undergoing the most honest transformation of your life, and you feel like you're doing something wrong. But what if this isn't a detour? What if this is exactly what becoming looks like before it takes form? Jung believed that true healing isn't about becoming more of what the world approves of. It's about becoming whole, integrating the rejected parts, listening to the quiet signals, living not from the mask, but from the marrow. And the marrow moves slowly. So if you find yourself unable to articulate where you're headed, if the future feels blank, if your inner fire is still more ember than flame, know this: you are not behind. You are not failing. You are in a stage that defies explanation, but not significance. This is the sacred darkness that precedes coherence. And one day you may look back on this space not as the time you lost your way, but as the moment you began to find your own. You don't return from this process as the same person, not because you've improved, not because you've mastered anything, but because something deeper has taken root, something quieter but truer. The old self was built to survive, to impress, to adapt, to earn its place. It was always scanning for what would work, what would please, what would protect. And in doing so, it built a life of momentum, not necessarily meaning, but now the scaffolding is gone. And in its place, something else is forming. Not a performance, a presence, not a role, a resonance. You may still look the same on the outside, same job, same home, same habits, but internally, everything has shifted. You no longer move to prove. You move because something in you hums, yes. This is the beginning of living from the self. And the self doesn't seek applause. It seeks alignment. It doesn't crave clarity. It trusts coherence. It doesn't rush. It responds. You may not be as productive as you once were. You may not care about metrics, milestones, or 5-year plans. But when you act now, it feels whole, undivided, not from pressure, but from peace. And that peace is hard won, Because living this way means letting go again and again of what doesn't resonate, even when it's convenient. It means saying no to opportunities that flatter the ego but dull the soul. It means following impulses that make no strategic sense but feel inexplicably right. This is not inertia, it's a new kind of motion, one that isn't forced but invited. And when that invitation comes, it doesn't sound like motivation. It sounds like presence, a quiet knowing, a full-body yes that doesn't need justification. Jung called this living the symbolic life, where the external no longer dictates the internal, but instead reflects it, where the ego is not exiled but integrated, where ambition isn't erased but repurposed. You're still allowed to want, to build, to move towards something that matters. But now the fuel is different. It doesn't burn you out, it carries you. Because it's not coming from fear, it's coming from truth. And that truth will shape a life that may look ordinary on the outside, but will feel unmistakably alive on the inside. No more chasing, no more proving, just a quiet devotion to what is real. This is not the end of your becoming. It's the beginning of your return. Not to who you were, but to who you've always been beneath the noise. And if the world never understands this version of you, that's okay, because you will. And in the end, that's the only motivation that ever really lasts. So if the fire has gone out, if you're standing in the stillness where drive once lived, ask yourself this: what if this isn't the end of your becoming, but the first moment you're finally becoming honest, not with the world, with yourself? And if you no longer need to prove anything, what would you do simply because it feels like truth?